Hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. Today, we will be talking about the first post-war plan that Israel has presented for what will happen in Gaza at the end of this conflict. So, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited. It's about time we had some idea of what's going to happen after the war, and I'm glad Israel finally got to it. So, we're talking about a plan that has been endorsed by all of the Israeli security services, the IDF, the Shabak, the internal security, Mossad. They've all stood behind this, and it's endorsed by the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who I have to say has shown some cojones in actually endorsing a plan, considering that anyone who endorses a plan is going to be at the forefront of receiving a lot of fire from politicians in Israel. The plan does not yet have the support of the coalition or of the cabinet. There is a debate going on in the cabinet right now as I'm recording. Um, we'll talk about whether I think it'll be adopted by the cabinet or not. So far, it has not been. So I'm going to introduce the plan, look at a few of the elements in it. It's important to note a few things before I start, or the most important two things before I start. Number one, we're talking about a gradual plan that will take time. So this will come into effect at the end of the conflict. End of the conflict means Israel controls Gaza. Hamas has surrendered in some way or another, whether through an agreement to leave or just through the fact that they've been subdued militarily, and the hostages have been returned. Um, Once that happens, that's when this deal would start to kick in. So we're not talking about doing this before the war has ended. And the guiding principle is a very clear one and a very good one. The plan says, quote, Hamas won't run Gaza, but neither will Israel. Palestinians live in the Gaza Strip, and they're responsible for their own affairs, as long as they are not hostile to Israel. And according to this plan, Israel will have full security authority. So while in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has services for security, both internal security like police and intersecurity service that is supposed to combat terrorism. None of these things will be present in Gaza, at least in the beginning. The Israeli military, the IDF, will be responsible for day-to-day security because the situation there is too fluid and dangerous for Israel to trust anyone else. But there will be no civilian administration. No Israeli civilians will be running Gaza. There is some civilian running of the West Bank under Kogat, under the defense ministry, because there are settlers there. There also used to be a much wider military government in the West Bank that used to control the affairs of the Palestinians as well. This plan avoids all that. So there are certain elements in the West Bank that are going to be absent here. Israel is going to be responsible for checking all incoming goods into Gaza, at least for as long as this plan continues. That will be in cooperation with the Egyptians. So the Egyptians will be given a strong role in running the Rafah crossing, which will remain the main crossing into Gaza. But Israel will have the authority and the ability to check anything that is coming in. A multinational task led by the partnership with the EU and the moderate Arab nations will take responsibility for running civil affairs and the economic rehabilitation of the Strip. And what that means is they will help the local Palestinian infrastructure, the local Palestinian bureaucracy, which we'll talk about in a minute, run things, training them, supplementing them, funding them. And they will undertake, this international coalition will undertake funding the reconstruction of Gaza, which according to the report that I saw in the Wall Street Journal, will take 7 to 10 years. And just getting rid of all the rubble, it said there, would take up to 1 year. And that sounds fairly realistic. The plan also notes Egypt will be a major actor in it, taking responsibility for the civilian border crossing to the Gaza Strip in coordination with Israel. Now, what that means to be a major actor in the plan, aside from overseeing the coming in of supplies through the Philadelphia route through the border, I don't know. But my guess is they will have more of a role than that. They don't have the funds to reconstruct. They do have the influence to play a role. Fourth, part of the plan, existing administrative mechanisms will be maintained, provided that officials are not affiliated with Hamas. So wherever possible, local municipalities, local councils will be maintained. Where Israel is particularly interested in maintaining current structures is where you have various clans running the more rural areas, areas on the outskirts of towns. A lot of those are run by local families. They're not associated with Hamas. They cooperate with Hamas because Hamas is the government. Um, Anyone who's directly affiliated with Hamas will be removed according to this plan. The Shabak, or the Shin Bet, whatever you want to call it, will look at the security credentials of every individual and approve them. If they have any direct ties to Hamas, they will be removed. I think the idea here is to have a soft touch to keep as much of the bureaucracy intact while not allowing Hamas to continue influence. Again, something that lessons that have been learned from the denazification of Germany, from the de-Baathification of Iraq. When you remove too many government officials, then you end up with complete ineptitude and corruption. Local authorities that currently deal with electricity, sewage, water, and humanitarian aid will continue to operate. They'll do so in collaboration with the multinational task force and as long as they pass that Shabak screening. But again, before any of this can happen, Hamas has to be destroyed and the hostages have to be returned. And Galant has made very clear that the people in northern Gaza, the people who live in northern Gaza, who are now refugees in the south, will not be allowed to return until the hostages are released. That's one of the major reasons that they're being kept out. According to a legal paper recently commissioned by the Israeli government, that's their legal justification for remaining in the north, is that it aids the task of bringing back the hostages. And until they're brought back, they will not be able to return to their homes. Now, there's two things that this plan does not mention that are very important and that foreign governments are going to ask Israel to include if they adopt this. The first is the PA is not involved. Uh, it's unclear whether this plan would allow for the PA to come in later. What Gallant has said about the PA is that they're not relevant until they reform. Meanwhile, Netanyahu has said the PA can't come in under any circumstances. So either way, they both agree the PA should not be involved right now. There will be other actors, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, who will ask, what is the horizon for involving the PA? They will want the PA to be involved. The fact that it's not included may be a good thing, because as I've said before, the PA must be reformed, otherwise they shouldn't be allowed into Gaza. And if Israel at first says, we're not going to have the PA in unless they reform, and they reform a lot, that gives Israel leverage. And leverage is a very good thing in this case. So I'm hoping the PA will eventually become involved, but only after they have serious reform. This plan will allow that. Another thing, which Israel is going to have, also going to have some serious problems with, is that it's basically agnostic about a Palestinian state. It's an interim plan. It calls for an interim phase. It doesn't mention whether or not there's going to be a Palestinian state. That may make it difficult for Arab states to go along. They will want Israel to say, this is going to eventually lead to a Palestinian state. Something that maybe Gallant would be willing to say, but Netanyahu is absolutely not willing to say. So the plan isn't particularly left wing because, as we said, it doesn't mention a two-state solution. It doesn't mention the returning of the PA. But what it does say is settlements are not going to return. There's not going to be annexation, and that means it's not a right-wing plan. And that means, of course, the right wing is unhappy with it. So, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich already attacked the plan just based on leaks without seeing the entire thing. And he said the following. The plan for the day after is a rerun of the plan for the day before October 7th. The solution in Gaza must involve thinking outside the box and changing the concept by encouraging voluntary immigration and establishing full security control, including a renewal of settlement. So security control is going to be in the Gaza Strip, at least for the interim period. and it doesn't say anything in the plan about anyone else having security control. But the renewal of settlement is ruled out by the plan. And of course, if there was the renewal of settlement, no external actor would be willing to accept it. Also, a lot of Israeli citizens and parties would not be willing to accept it. It would make it very difficult. Now, I've said before there's a very strong need for a plan. If there is no plan, the Israeli military is just sitting there, aimless, in Gaza. Hamas will believe that at some point the IDF will withdraw. So their plan will be to hit the troops as much as possible and bring about withdrawal, something they'll probably do anyway. But if there's no vacuum, if there is no vacuum for them to fill, if there's a government in there installed by Israel, it becomes a lot more difficult for Hamas to operate. And that's what this plan would do. It would prevent Hamas from going back into governance. And that was the entire idea, the operation. Um, Blinken is now going to the Middle East to discuss the day after. That almost certainly is the reason this plan was released when was released. This provides Blinken with something to discuss with Israel. As I said, the cabinet has not accepted it, but at least there's a paper to talk over. Right now, the plan, the way it stands, will be rejected by, I believe, just about everyone. Don't get me wrong. The US, UAE, Egypt, etc., will accept it because it doesn't include an Arab state and it doesn't include the PA. Neither of those things need to happen immediately for them to accept it, but there'll need to be some horizon for it. Uh, the Israeli cabinet will probably not accept it. Honestly, there's probably a majority of people in the cabinet who would like for this plan to pass if it was purely a diplomatic and security issue, but it ain't. This is also a political issue. There's about 30% of the cabinet that would be against this deal because it doesn't include settlements, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and their ilk, and Netanyahu is afraid to part with them because he fears they're what's protecting him from his government collapsing. Otherwise, he's at the mercy of his rival, Benny Gantz. So my guess is the coalition is going to reject it. My guess is Netanyahu is going to reject it. I've even heard some hints that Netanyahu is saying that he's against the plan. But I don't think that rejection will be wholehearted. I think what is going to happen is because that's the only plan that Israel has, and there is no way the government is going to adopt a right-wing Smotrich Ben Gvir plan, because then there's nothing to discuss with anyone. This will become the de facto document over which Israel will be negotiating. So this has happened before. After 1967, when Israel took over the West Bank, it was trying to figure out what borders it wanted to demand there. One member of the government, Yigal Allon, came up with a plan. He drew maps. He received a lot of flack for it. Um, he said what areas should be returned, and the government could never agree to it because it was too controversial. But whenever they needed to negotiate borders, they went to that map because that map was the only thing that they had on file. So Israel would probably end up negotiating using this paper even without accepting it. But that's not a very good hand to have. If the plan doesn't have the full authority and the full backing of the government, it's hard to take it to the next step. The Allon plan never went to the next step. So I think we're going to end up with something like that. It's a kind of in between where this plan is accepted but not fully, and Netanyahu says all kinds of things that counter it. That's not really a good state of affairs. A much healthier state of affairs is if there was an actual discussion between Gallant and Netanyahu on a plan that they both could accept, and then they have that plan and produce it to the moderate Arab states and to the United States. Unfortunately, Gallant and Netanyahu's relationship has never been worse. Netanyahu has been trying to stop Gallant from meeting the heads of the security services. This is probably one of the reasons, because they were coming up with this plan together. Gallant accused, according to leaks, Netanyahu of working against the security of the country. So this kind of dysfunction may end up torpedoing the plan. But this is a fairly good plan that should be acceptable on the whole, with some alterations to the Israeli government. After all, it is not a left-wing plan. It does not include the PA. It does not include even two states. If the government can't even agree to this, then they can only agree to something that includes the return of settlements and maybe the voluntary removal of Gaza residents like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich want. That will not be accepted by anyone, and that is tantamount to not having a plan. Okay, I got some questions from you, and let's get to answering them. John Price asks, I heard reports that most hostages are in the central part of the Strip, where Israel is advancing right now. Since the negotiations are heading slow, what is the policy about them now? Trying to rescue them even if the success rate is low, or negotiating with a local battalion that is holding them? Okay, so some of them are being held in the central camps, but a lot of them are being held in Khan Yunis. And I'm guessing a bunch of them are held in Rafah too. So I wouldn't count on any reports you're seeing that they're in this place mostly or in that place mostly. From what we're hearing, they're spread around. Some of them are probably with Sinwar, from what we're hearing, trying to keep him alive. And that means that getting them out in any way before the war is over will be impossible because they're playing an important role. You suggested trying to rescue them or negotiating with local battalions. Trying to rescue them has so far mostly led to deaths. There was one successful release in a military operation. Mostly it's just very dangerous. And even the military killed 3 hostages who managed to escape. It's not been a great success in that regard. Israel will probably continue to do that when it has good enough intelligence, but that is not a macro level solution to this problem. It doesn't release large enough numbers and it gets some of them killed. As for local battalions, I don't think the Hamas has degraded to that point yet. I certainly haven't heard that it has. That might be able to happen in the future. Basically, what's been happening so far is hostages are being taken out of the care of battalions that are under heavy assault, taken out of the care of areas where Israel's gone in frontally. So neither one of those things is probably going to work, or may work in very isolated cases of like one, two, three, four people, something like that. If you want to get them all out, there's 2 tracks for negotiations, one with Qatar to release about 50 hostages, and one through Egypt to end the war and release all the hostages. That's what's happening now. We're not close to an agreement on either of those. Brad S. asks, after the bombing in Beirut, Lebanon, some have been making a lot of noise about the sovereignty of borders and that attacks crossing them are some kind of red line that cannot be crossed. We know they have been allowing Hezbollah rockets to attack Israel from over that same border for months. I understand this is bad faith propaganda, but I'm also trying to understand how they want to present this idea in diplomatic terms when it's so nakedly hypocritical. Are they just saying our side can do it, but the other cannot? Are they saying there's a qualitative difference? Are they attempting to make any claims about border sovereignty that are not obviously situational? That's a good question, Brad. Yeah, it's very clear that Israel's neighbors don't have very coherent arguments about why they're allowed to break international law and Israel is not. When pressed, they'll often say that they're resisting colonialism, apartheid, genocide, occupation, whatever word they're using, and therefore their crimes are justified. And Israel is the strong state side and needs to obey international law. Of course, international law doesn't work that way. If you break international law, you break it. It doesn't matter if you're a terrorist, it doesn't matter if you're a state. States are more accountable, but terrorist organizations are also supposed to break it, to honor it. Now, as far as Lebanon is concerned, Lebanon can say that they're not the ones attacking Israel. It's Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is not officially an arm of the government. They are an arm of a political party that is very strong in Lebanon, but that doesn't make it an arm of the government. And there's actually some truth to that. Most non-Hezbollah parties and people in Lebanon do not want Hezbollah to be attacking Israel, not because they love Israel, but because they fear that if Lebanon is caught up in a war, the whole country will collapse, which it might. So they don't really represent Lebanon; they represent themselves. So there's some plausible deniability there. But so they would say those things. Hezbollah doesn't represent Lebanon, and armed resistance against colonial apartheid, whatever, is justified. Not great arguments, but those are their arguments. Aliyah Aloha asks, does Hezbollah control all of Lebanon? It's a related question. The official government seems completely powerless. Also, recently I ate at a Middle Eastern restaurant and they featured wines and beers from Lebanon. Yeah, and some of it's really good too. I'm shocked Hezbollah allows that. Do you know why? So the wine and beer question links up to the first question. Does Hezbollah control all of Lebanon? The answer is absolutely no, it does not. Lebanon is a balance of ethnicities, um, and that balance is always contested by the different sides. Used to be that the Christians were the dominant side. There was a time when the Sunnis were the dominant side briefly. Now the Shiites are the dominant side. But all the groups there have a say. The Druze have a say, the Armenians have a say, the Christians have a say, etc., etc. And so when you're drinking wine and beer, the wine and beer you're drinking is almost all produced by Christians. They're the ones who produce it. If you told the Christians in Lebanon you can't drink alcohol, they would be outraged. That's part of the balance, is that Christians are allowed to make and produce wine and alcohol. And I'll tell you a secret: a large amount of the Muslims in Lebanon also drink regularly. Not everyone in Lebanon is, a great believer who keeps all of the precepts of Islam. I've seen estimates that 30 to 40% of Muslims in Lebanon drink at least occasionally. So it's really easy to get alcohol in Lebanon, and it will continue to be unless Hezbollah takes over the entire country, which there's no sign of that happening anytime soon. Okay, so that's the end of Israel Explained for today. If you like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media and listening to my podcast of Israel podcast. I will see you here tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me.